In June 2020, he was appointed General Counsel Emeritus and Senior Partner, Indigenous and Accessibility, leading Deloitte's Reconciliation and Disability Initiatives. Having retired from Deloitte, Ken recently joined the Return on Disability Group as a Managing Director. In 2012, Ken was appointed by the federal government to chair a panel which studied and reported on employment opportunities for people with disabilities in the private sector. Ken is a recognized leader in the legal profession. In 2012, he and his team were awarded the General Counsel Social Responsibility Award. In 2013, he was recognized as one of Canada's most influential lawyers and judges, and that was from Canadian Lawyer magazine. In 2018, he was named Canada's Outstanding General Counsel, and in 2021, this is exhausting to read. In 2021,
that's true.
he was recognized by Canadian Corporate Counsel Association with the RVA Jones Award, which recognizes exceptional contributions to the development of the in-house counsel bar. And later in the same year, he was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award as part of the annual Canadian General Counsel Awards. As an active and engaged leader in the community, Ken's received many awards, including the Queen's Jubilee Medal, the King Clancy Award for his work supporting Canadians who live with disabilities, the SABA Diversity Award, and the David C. Onley Award for his work related to creating a more inclusive Canada for people with disabilities. In November of the same year, he was recognized by Catalyst Canada Business Leader Award for his leadership in diversity in corporate Canada. In October of 21, he was recognized by Leaders to be Proud of with the Leading Executive Ally Award. So please let's welcome Ken Fredeen.
Thank you. Thank you.
And since Ken prefers an interview format over making a speech, we're very pleased today that we have Mariah Hillis, who's going to conduct the interview. And I'll just give a little synopsis of Mariah's life. She's this church's disability consultant and has helped organize the conference, ensuring that the disability community was properly represented. She's passionate about making sure that people with disabilities are able to get a quality education, and is receiving her bachelor's degree in education and planning on getting a special education certification in the future. She has a background in disability advocacy and consulting through her writing, and has given speeches and talks on making education more accessible. The most notable speech was given in Parliament, of all places, in Parliament in 2017 as a part of the Daughters of the Vote program. Mariah was thrilled to be able to work on this conference and hopes that it will make a positive impact on the community. So please also welcome Mariah Hillis. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken and Mariah.
Well, I think my first question might have already been answered a little bit here, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So how did you get involved in the work of disability in corporate Canada?
Yeah, so just, you know, it's funny, people ask me why, and I have a simple answer for them. I say, it's because I'm from Saskatchewan. And if they really care, they'll ask me what I mean by that. And I'll say, well, I grew up in a family where cooperatives, you know, social, caring, you know, hard work, all of those characteristics, which I think are really important to Saskatchewan folks. I grew up with that, and so I've carried it to Toronto. It didn't beat me out of me. I kept it. And I think that's my interest: is how do you create a more equitable, inclusive society that benefits more people?
All right.
Were you waving at me up there? No, he wasn't even waving at me. Good.
Okay, so how did you use your leadership and influence other leaders?
Yeah, so I just a bit of context here, because I was general counsel at Deloitte, so you know the name Deloitte. We have an office here in Saskatoon. About 8,000 people work for Deloitte, revenues of about $2 billion, offices in all but one province. tied globally to a global organization of 200 and some thousand people. It's a big organization, and I was general counsel, so I had a team of 25. I was, prior to joining Deloitte as general counsel in 2000, I was associate general counsel at Canadian Airlines. There's a few people that would remember that airline. And I was based in Calgary. So my whole life experience has really been working in-house in corporate Canada, and with increasingly more important roles, ultimately at Deloitte as part of the executive team and leading a team of 25. My sort of interest outside of that, though, was a curiosity around leadership and how leadership can play a role to create change. And so I was part of a group of general counsel in Toronto, mainly in Toronto, that focused in on what is the role of general counsel? How can we play an influential role in creating positive change? Mainly around a more inclusive legal profession, which was pretty broad. That brought me into a whole experience of working with other general counsel, other leaders, senior leaders, and through that work led me to move into more corporate sort of senior leadership roles through things like having discussions with our clients around business, but also around DEI, and also other things that corporations could do to create a more inclusive economy. So I kind of evolved over time, over the 20 years in Toronto, up to ultimately being recognized as a senior leader who actually really did a lot in the DEI space, and then more recently in the accessibility space.
This is not on my list, but I need to ask it. When you were...
I told Mariah she could ask me anything. So this is good. I like this.
When you were working for Deloitte and Canadian Airlines and all these other companies, were you thinking about like the accessibility of your company to customers as well, like just beyond employers?
That's initially no. And I have to admit that my evolution into the disability space took time. And I argued one of the first cases defending the airline around the handling of a passenger with disabilities in a wheelchair. And so I argued that. That was the first case heard by the Canadian Transportation Agency, and I argued for the airline, which started leading me into sort of an exploration of the transportation of people with disabilities. In fact, at one time, I got a call from Rick Hansen that we destroyed his chair. It's true. And he was getting a runaround by an agent saying that there was a tariff limit of, I think, $200 for this, I don't know how expensive it was at that time, $10,000 chair. And I said to them, we've just ruined the man in motion's chair. He's getting a new chair, and it's going to happen quickly. I think, I don't care what the tariffs, I don't care what the contract says. The reality of it is that we've destroyed his chair. So I think that started it. But I'll tell you, I want to say this because I'm going to forget. And that is that the guy that really started me on this journey, that was about 10 years ago. Actually just over 10 years ago. And his name was David Onley. And David was the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. You probably know that. And he passed away recently, suddenly, far too soon, because he had a lot more work to give. But he was the guy that, almost like being in a church, I was anointed by David through the work I'd done in the DEI space to say, you have a responsibility as a senior leader in Canada and the business community to do something about the disability space. And he more or less said that to me. I knew what he was saying. And that was just about 10 years ago, which is really when, for me, the rockets took off in terms of saying, I need to be a leader that is going to do more about this because there's a lot of work to be done. So I give all the credit to David Onley. His funeral's on Monday. I won't be there for it, but remarkable man.
All right. So do you think there are more people with disabilities in corporate Canada now than there were in the past?
Well, this is a really good question. And first of all, I'd like to say that, and I should have said this earlier, is that for those that, that need it, I am an older, white, typically abled, straight, cisgendered male. My pronouns are he and him. I'm wearing a yellow shirt, so I could be distinguished, and blue slacks and a blue blazer. And I have glasses, for those that need a description of what I look like. I don't speak, I'm very careful. I don't speak for disability communities. I firmly believe that it's nothing about us without us. And so I'm very careful. My role as a leader is really to, as I see it, is to clear off the stage as quickly as possible so that I can create space for others and who are not like me. So I want to put it in context. I have my views, and some of them we'll get into, and some of them may be controversial, and some of them you may not agree with. That's okay. And I might be wrong, because I have been wrong in this space, because I have no lived experience. But I'll say this, that where I'm working now, which is at the Return on Disability group, looks at the disability space, in my opinion, completely different than it's been looked at in the past. And that is on the basis that, and this is what I came to understand over the years, is that being more inclusive for people with disabilities within an organization is just good for business. And the company I work for now actually has the proof of that. And I love that approach, because when you integrate disability into how you operate as a business, you're a better business. And I can dive more deeply into that if you like, but we've proven that. But what is lost in that is that too often people look at the disability space and they say they need jobs. That's true. That's true. I completely agree with that. Unemployment amongst people with disabilities is greater than the typically abled community. On the other hand, there are between 25 and 30% of our population are people with disabilities. That's a massive number, 25 to 30%. These people with disabilities work within organizations already. And what I think corporations misunderstand is that the population of people with disabilities within their company is already there, and it's going to represent generally the population of the country, which is about 25 to 30%. Now, disclosure rates for most companies in corporate Canada, banks as an example, would be 4, 5, 6%. Okay? So only 4 or 5, 6% of the population within their organizations are disclosing a disability. Why is that? Well, it's stigma, for one thing. No question about it. That's a real issue, and I know you're going to ask me a question around promotion. But the other thing is, what they don't understand, that if they better serve the other 25% of the population of disabilities within that company, they're going to be more productive. They're going to be better at doing their jobs. They're going to be happy, more engaged. They're going to do better work for you. It's better for your business. And that's what we're trying to do at Return on Disability Group, is help companies understand how they better serve employees with disabilities and customers with disabilities. And when that happens, it's integrated into how you do business. And that means sustainable change. Not a simple one-off hire. It's a sustainable change about how you hire, retain, promote, and also serve people with disabilities better.
All right. So people with disabilities are less likely to be employed than someone without a disability. Do you think the lack of people with disabilities in the corporate space is because the space is physically inaccessible, or do you think there's more to it?
Yeah. So, I mean, other than, I think that the population of people with disabilities who are working is higher than we understand. Mm-hmm. What we don't understand as corporations is how to make it easier for them. I'll give you an example. I mean, COVID is a wonderful example of a fundamental change in how corporations do their business. You know, prior to COVID, you would have a person with disabilities, and they would ask for an accommodation where they could work from home 2 or 3 days a week. And the corporation's answer likely would have been, and I would have been the same as a business leader, we need you in the office because we need team, we need, we have everything here that you need. You can maybe work 2 days from home, but we can't accommodate more than 2 days. COVID happens, and all of a sudden everybody's working from home. And what was said couldn't be possible actually is possible. And that accommodation of people with disabilities, because a lot of the barriers that exist getting people to work, to and from work, are preventing people with disabilities from being fully employed or employed at all. I think that the challenge around hiring more people with disabilities is a complex one that requires a number of things. We identified in the report. I know you're going to get to the report in a minute. I think some of those challenges exist today. Some are improving slowly. There is progress being made.
So you talked about this a little bit, but due to the pandemic, more corporate spaces are shifting to a more like hybrid work environment. And like due to this, is there more opportunity for people with disabilities to enter the corporate space?
I think there are. But by the way, I just want to be clear, and I'm going to say this a number of times, the very accommodations that people with disabilities could use, and in some cases are demanding, are the very accommodations that people like me benefit from. So I use the example of a curb cut. The curb cut was designed for wheelchairs, but in fact, the curb cut serves a whole number of people that didn't know they needed it, but all of a sudden it's there, and the skateboards are going down, the parents with carriages pushing it. So the curb cut actually is a more inclusive design that actually benefits a lot more people other than people in wheelchairs. Now, let's not forget that the disability space, people tend to focus in on things that they can see. But about 95% of the disabilities are not seen. And they can range from temporary to permanent, and they can be a whole number of things. It's that disability space. I think the accessibility part of it, the Rick Hansen Foundation is doing some good work around some standards around that. By the way, the federal government is coming up with a new building code that is going to exceed any of the Rick Hansen Foundation things. And a lot of provinces are will accept the building code changes so they become provincial as well as federal. But those changes will create a much more accessible place. We focus on the wheelchair, but there's all sorts of things that are associated with inclusive design that companies are starting to understand they need to do. I'm very optimistic around this. It's not just from a corporate desire to be more inclusive. It's also because there's better regulation around inclusive design that didn't exist 10 years ago when we did our study.
You talked about this a little bit as well, but is it possible that there are more people with disabilities in corporate spaces, but they're not identified because their disability is invisible?
It's funny. So I was appointed, I asked to step out of the role of general counsel a year before my mandatory retirement, which, by the way, I highly recommend. I know people are somehow sort of don't like mandatory. I loved it because I knew the date that I expired, and I worked towards it, and it makes your career, I think, more meaningful. But anyway, my final year in the partnership, before I turned 62, I asked if I could step out of the role of general counsel, be appointed as senior partner for reconciliation and also for accessibility, because I was challenged by a managing partner as a leader, to leave a purpose or a path around purpose. I was very lucky to work in an organization that actually challenged me. So I was appointed senior partner, reconciliation and accessibility. And we created at Deloitte Canada's first corporate reconciliation action plan. I'm very proud of that. Other companies now have followed that. And I think that's really important. But I said for doing it for reconciliation, we should do it for accessibility as well. And so we created the first corporate accessibility action plan, which is really a foundational document around how you become more inclusive for people with disabilities. In the process of doing that work, I spent time with employees that shared with me their disabilities, that nobody knew. And it was around how they could work better through some of the accommodations that could be made by the firm. It was an eye-opening experience for me, that a lot of what I thought was good design actually required a lot more work so these people could be more productive in their jobs. Things like noise, things like visual, and I could go on. But when you start, as a corporation, to address your mind to what you really need to do to become more inclusive for people with disabilities, and you spend time on it, you have structure around it, governance around it, that's when things start to change. And I think it starts with a written document that you're held accountable to. That's my view.
So for people with disabilities to succeed in the workplace, we often need different types of accommodations. Is the corporate Canada improving at offering different types of accommodations to people?
Yeah, they are. And I think sometimes people from communities, disability communities, there's not enough of a connection between business and communities. There needs to be more of that, more sharing. Because if there were, I think we'd be working together better than we are. But I think there are a number of developments that I'm very positive about. First of all, there's provincial legislation that is requiring change to occur. The AODA in Ontario, which the last review was done by David Onley 4 years ago. The present review is being done by my boss, Rich Donovan. And that's really around what is the success around disability legislation in the province of Ontario. To be honest, it's not very good. The second part of it is that the ACA, the Accessible Canada Act, which some of you are familiar with, is a phenomenal piece of legislation. That requires federally regulated companies like banks, airlines, telecoms, to create what are called accessibility action plans. And those are really what we created at Deloitte under my supervision, which was an accessibility action plan. But this is to the federal legislation. I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure that those corporations would be doing one without the legislation. I think the legislation is a driver for that. But I do know that a lot of those companies were doing work in the accessibility space prior to that. This is just solidifying it, codifying it, and taking it up a level. So the answer to your question is, I think
A website, and one thing I believe it said was that things needed to be accessible by 2040. Is that true, or am I misremembering that?
I don't think it's quite that long, but
Okay, because
it's
that
probably
was
longer than everybody would like.
yeah, because that was my thought when I read whatever it actually is.
For some areas it might be true. Like some of the built environment, right?
Yeah.
Is very difficult to modify.
Mm-hmm.
I think those modifications will occur, and I think they're getting better. I mean, great work here, Brenda, with you and the accessibility of this church now that didn't exist before. That took a directive mind and took some money. But, you know, I think I just want to get this on the table too, is that one thing that we forget is that when you're hiring people with disabilities, we think that, oh my goodness, the accommodations are going to be great. I mean, how do we do this? And they usually think of, you know, accessibility things for wheelchairs. Mm-hmm. That may be true, but a lot of the new buildings have that now. But the average accommodation cost is about $500. That's for people who need it. And it's a very small number of people that actually need any accommodation. The people who know what accommodations they need have already figured it out. The people with disabilities have figured out what accommodations they need, and they just need to know that their workplace is going to provide the same level of service that they've come to expect because they've figured out what their accommodation needs are.
Yeah. Well, my actual question about the Canada Act was, do you think it's enough? Do you think it covers enough?
I'll tell you what's going to be enough. It's going to be enough when the federal government starts enforcing to the plans that are created.
Yes.
What I'm curious about is these plans are words. And just to be clear and express my conflict of interest, we're helping some of those federal employers draft their plans. We're helping them with getting feedback from actual users. So these are users with disabilities who use the services of a federally regulated company, like a bank or an airline. And we're doing some phenomenal work. We've got a methodology we use where we send secret shoppers in, and they experience, and we get the reports back, we summarize the reports, and to the client. And then we work with the client around ironing out those potholes and the bumps. Now, I think that I think all federal employers are taking those plans really seriously. I give them credit. They're well-intentioned, they're spending money, they're really getting feedback and consultations from people with disabilities. But it's what happens in the second and third year around, are they held accountable for what they say they need to do? And if they're not doing enough, are they going to be held accountable by the federal government to ensure that they are? And by the way, that's only in the federal regime. We need that in the provincial regime as well. We need provincial equivalent legislation. And there's no reason why that can't happen. There's no reason. They've got the template. It's in Ottawa, in the Accessibility Act. It needs the political will, and that's what is needed, is support to the politicians to create and enforce the legislation that's made. That's when you're going to see the big change.
Yeah. So has Corporate Canada thought about how they can hire more people with disabilities?
Yeah, and I love this topic because I'll tell you a story. I coached Special Olympics basketball back in Oakville. And by the way, my sister's here, Shirley, so I tell Shirley this, it's my favorite day of the week because I get to spend time with phenomenally talented people. I just love coaching, and I love coaching Special Olympics basketball. Anyway, when I was doing this pre-pandemic, I thought to myself, I was coaching, and I was teaching them how to do a fast break, and their intensity around learning, around execution. I thought, why aren't these people working? Why are they not in paid jobs? Because, and I'm talking paid jobs, I'm one of these people that there should be no person that works for free. These social agencies that just employ people and just make work and they're not paid. If it's a job, they get paid, and they should be paid the same as everybody else. And so this was my thought, and so I went to the CEO of Special Olympics for Ontario, and I said to her, I've got this idea. Why don't we have Special Olympics athletes working in our head office at Deloitte? It's like a 25-story, building at Deloitte. It's big. Lots of needs in there, varied needs of people. And so we worked with Special Olympics Ontario. I worked with Ready, Willing, and Able. I don't know if anybody's from here from that organization. Phenomenal. Federally funded. They do phenomenal work. We partnered with them. And we had 8 Special Olympics athletes working within Deloitte offices. 8. All in paid positions, doing varied jobs. The most senior was working in our university there, helping coordinate and register, and phenomenal employees. I would tell people at Deloitte, we did this. We have these 8 athletes working. And they would say, why didn't you make a big deal of this? This is phenomenal. And I said, well, the point of it is that we've integrated these people into how we do our business. We're paying them, and they're doing phenomenal work. Shouldn't matter they're from Special Olympics. But I think that when it comes to employers, one of the findings in our report back 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago, by the way, we tabled that report, was that if there's not leadership within an organization, if there isn't somebody at a senior level who takes it on as an ally or as a person from a community, it's unlikely to happen. That leadership component is critically important to employment. And that quite often is lacking within corporate Canada. We're not seeing enough leadership around this space. We need more of it, which is why I did what I did, and why I'm doing what I'm doing. You need leaders to talk to leaders to say, this is why you need to do it. Talk about the business case and the importance of hiring. And I believe, I'm an optimist. Honestly, I think, and there's one thing that I think is missing, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute, but I think it's happening, and there's going to be more of it. I'm optimistic it will.
Well, I hope so. So are people with disabilities able to like move up within the corporate structure and like and get promotions, or are they more often at more in entry level positions?
I'll be honest with you. I think part of non-disclosure is around stigma. And, you know, this comes back to one of the three findings in the report. One is, you know, leadership. I actually put it backwards in the report and said leadership third. Leadership is number one. The second one is around understanding the business case. Understanding the importance of hiring, retaining, promoting people with disabilities, but also serving people with disabilities better. We do a crappy job at it. So that's the second thing, is the business case. The third one is education. And you must educate people around disabilities, perceptions, around low productivity, around, you know, any number of things. And those misconceptions, those myths, need to be corrected through education within corporations for the employment to change. And that will then allow for people to be promoted. But I want to be clear, it's happening now today that people with disabilities are being promoted. We just don't know they have disabilities. So they're being promoted. It's those that have disclosed that need to be tracked around their promotions within organizations. But I can give you, I won't disclose, but I can give you a number of examples of people in very senior positions that have disabilities that you don't know, but they've told me. So they're in senior positions, so it can happen, but it's a lot harder work to be promoted unless the accommodations are there to allow them to be the best that they can be.
Mm-hmm. One thought I had was just around careers. You often talk about people with disabilities just getting a job, but we don't want just jobs. We want a full career. We want to be able to move on and do everything we want to do. We don't just want to have that entry-level job. Are people with disabilities able to like gain that type of like full career, do you think? Or it's similar.
Well, I think it's a really good question. Look, I'm going to say something maybe a little bit controversial, and please accept my apology in advance. But because of the role that I've had, I get referred, people are referred to me, and particularly in the legal space. So lawyers with disabilities will be referred to me. And by the way, not as many as you might think, which is a good thing. But I've had enough exposure to young people, and by the way, not just people with disabilities, but other young people will approach me and ask for coaching, career, mentoring. And, you know, I've had them come up to me and they'll say, can you get me a job at Deloitte? This is when I was general counsel at Deloitte. And I'll say to them, why? Why would I hire you? They say, well, I need a job. Can you get me a job? And I'd say, well, I'll tell you what, you go away and you explore the careers within Deloitte. You figure out what you're passionate about, what you're really good at, what value you can add to Deloitte, and match it up to where you think that place is within Deloitte, and come back and talk to me about that. Some would, some wouldn't. But my point there is around careers, is that I think that with technology, with inclusive design, and particularly now of options of working from home more often, I think there are wonderful careers for everyone. But you've got to know yourself, what you're good at, what makes you passionate, what really makes you excited, whether you're a person typically able to not, and you need to then understand, and where is that career? Where do I get it? But if you don't understand yourself first, it's difficult for an employer to say, well, you can't really figure out what you want to do, but tell you what, why don't you come in and sort of explore things and see how it goes? That's not how business works. You need to be very directional about what value you add to an organization. By the way, in the disability community, there's a higher percentage of people with post-secondary education than the typically abled community. So of the 800 and some thousand people with disabilities, there's a high percentage of people with a lot of education. So it's connecting the dots from that education into work. And this is where I think it's really incumbent on people working with people with disabilities and also people with disabilities. And I say that to them, but I'd say it to anybody looking for work. Understand what you're really good at, what you really love to do, and then figure out where you're going to place those skills, which corporation. And I'll guarantee you get a job. and a meaningful career.
All right. So when you chaired the federal panel on employment for people with disabilities, what were some of your key findings?
Yeah, so, I mean, that's interesting how that happened. By the way, that was a conservative government. Jim Flaherty led that. And I got a call one day from his office asking if I would chair this panel, which looked at the employment of people with disabilities in the private sector. And why me? I'm not a conservative. My father would roll over in his grave if he knew that. But he asked me because he was friends with David Onley. And when he asked David Onley who should chair this panel, David said it should be me. So I was lucky. I got an opportunity to serve leading this panel. We interviewed 70 employers. I did about 10 or 12 myself to understand what were their practices, what were their perceptions around hiring people with disabilities. And that report was published, tabled actually exactly 10 years ago. It's still relevant today. I still get calls on it about people wanting to use it. What we found there was that there were some pockets of excellence in corporate Canada. Some wonderful examples of people who took the initiative, companies that took the initiative. Now, the problem was that most of those great examples were caused by were created by leaders, great leaders. When you had great leadership that drove the initiative, it happened. But there wasn't enough leadership. So that was the first finding. Not enough leadership. We needed more leadership. The second finding was that and I do this today, by the way, you can give me any senior leader in the corporate Canada, and they'll walk out of that meeting wanting to know more, wanting to do something more. Why? Because I'll talk them around the fact that your productivity is going to improve by 10% when you get better at serving people with disabilities. And the population of people with disabilities in this country is the size of Vancouver and Toronto combined. And globally, it's the size of China. So if you say to them, are you prepared to drive by a marketplace of a population the size of Toronto and Vancouver? They say, definitely not. Are you prepared globally to walk by an opportunity the size of China? They say, definitely not. That's the marketplace. And people with disabilities have been underserved. They've been underserved. And corporations that understand better how they serve people with disabilities are going to be better businesses, are going to make more money. That's the business case. It's kind of simple, but it's all proven by evidence. It's not based on some social cause, but on evidence. The third thing is around education. There still today is a lot of misconception around disabilities, and that has to change, and that comes through corporate initiatives around education. And I'll just say one other thing, this is a very recent development, which I think is a very positive one. You've all heard of ESG. ESG is environmental, social, and governance. And investors are making decisions on how well you do ESG. And whereas 10 years ago it was called corporate responsibility, and it was just a booklet, it was just some words on a page, this stuff they're held accountable for. So environmental, obviously, is something that everybody has in their mind. What are you doing? Net zero emissions is an example. Governance is around how do you have better governance, so more women, particularly on boards. That is changing. There's more representation of women on boards than there ever has been. Other forms of diversity as well. The one that's missing, disability. I challenge anybody to find a company with somebody with a disability on a board. It's not there. That has to change. And I'm doing something about that, by the way, and another thing I'm working on. But the point there is that the S in ESG is not understood. And a lot of corporations are struggling to understand how do we actually deliver on the promise of S, which is social. And my point on that, when I talk to the business leaders, is this is a perfect opportunity to do something in the disability space that allows you to say what you've done under S. And I think that's the big opportunity. Don't tell anybody my secret because I plan to use it in the business I'm in. But I think that's going to create real change in corporate Canada as well. There's a lot of different moving forces around this, a lot of momentum that I think is going to change things fundamentally in the future.
So what observations do you have on corporations' willingness to hire, retain, and promote people with disabilities?
Yeah, I think they are, but I think they're seeing it differently. I think they're looking to hire people with disabilities as sort of a social thing. That's not a sustainable employment model, in my opinion. It's sustainable when it becomes integrated in how you operate as a business. And we're not seeing enough of that. And that's why when I retired, I'm working with Rich Donovan at Return Disability Group, because that's how he sees it. That's a sustainable employment model. You know, as an example, in the States, I was invited to be a keynote speaker at the Harkin Institute. So you probably know who Harkin is, Senator Harkin, who is really the sponsor of the legislation in the U.S. that's very old now. But anyway, the sort of discussion there was around hiring. And what I heard down there, by the way, there's a real military approach to disability space in the U.S. because of military disabilities and so there's a lot of focus in corporate U.S. around hiring disabled veterans. That's a real focus in the U.S. But what was interesting about this was that, you know, when you hire people based on a grant you've got from the federal government, so let's say a subsidized wage, the first people to go in a recession are those people. That is not a sustainable model. You know, this has got we've got to change. Corporations have to think differently around the hiring. It's not around doing something nice and sweet and are we good people and publicizing that. It's really around understanding that your business is much better by doing it. There's more work to be done on that. But again, I'm seeing a lot more positive development in the 10 years since we did our study.
You mentioned this a little bit, but so you work for the Return on Disability Group. Can you tell us a bit about what that is and what you do for them? Because I actually don't know.
Yeah, that's good. So when I was appointed chair of the federal panel, there's one guy's name that kept coming up. This got to meet this guy, and his name was Rich Donovan. And you can look him up. Rich is well known in the global space. At the time, he was living in New York. And he was a broker at Merrill Lynch on Wall Street. He's a numbers guy. MBA from Columbia University. Probably the smartest guy I've ever worked with in my life, and I've worked with smart people. And so I got to know him. Actually, we were at this disability conference together. I was invited by the governor of Delaware down to Wilmington. And he was invited too. We ended up sitting beside each other. And I always joke that after the session at the end of the day, Rich almost got me killed crosswalking in Wilmington because he's cerebral palsy, and so he's walking across the road where cars are going by. I said, Rich, what are you doing? And that was sort of my introduction to Rich. This guy's a maverick. His thinking on this is completely different than anybody else. And what I loved about it was really around this service. How do you delight customers with disabilities? How do you serve them better? Well, how do you know? How do you know? So the work that we do is around, again, putting in users, actual users of services with disabilities, pursuant to a study that we've created, that they go and test, and then they report back, and that helps the business get better. So I love that because that's integrating business into the disability space in a way that has never been done before. And the same applies for employees. You know, like I said, 30% of the population of people with disabilities. Do you actually ever consult with them to find out what they need to do their jobs better? And so we do that for them as well. I joined them because with my experience and sort of my reputation, I felt that I could help them in the relationship, building relationships to get the conversation going with senior business leaders, and that's what I'm doing. I'm having a blast because not only is it a lot of fun, but it's also very purposeful. Because at the end of the day, when you look back, when you retire and say, I can see the changes that occurred since we started doing our work, that's going to be hugely gratifying. And we're moving into the US, and we're going to move into Europe as well. So this is a global play, all based out of Canada, and I'm proud of Canada leading on this. I think we have an opportunity here, particularly with the ACA, that we can show a different path than how it's been followed in other parts of the world. So it's exciting.
So can you reflect on the importance of legislation and regulations when it comes to employment for people with disabilities?
Yeah, I'd like to say that you don't need legislation because it's such a natural way of how you do business, but I'd be naive and I'd be misleading you. Legislation plays a really critical role. I'm seeing it with the ACA. Like I said, I'm not sure that a lot of federally regulated companies would be doing what they're doing, but for the Accessible Canada Act. And I think that's sad because I would like to think that it should be more of a natural thing. When you're talking more than 50% of the population who are impacted, that they're impacted in the disability space, because you've got 25 to 30% of the population plus friends and family, you're talking a majority. And I've met business leaders who were very, I would say, innocent or ignorant of the disability space. I know of one in particular, and because I had the conversation with him, and he was hit by a truck riding his bike, and he's now a paraplegic. And believe me, he understands the disability space like probably not many two others. And I always say to people, as you age, you're going to become disabled, you're going to join this community. We're all going to join it at some point. So why not do something about it now to make it better for us? And by the way, those people who are retiring, people like me, we're boomers. We have lots of money. So we're not going to put up with crap. And that population is just starting to show itself in the service of people with disabilities. So I think that legislation is important. I would hope ultimately it'll be a natural way of how businesses do business. But we're a ways from that. So in the meantime, legislation I think is important.
Great. So what's next for you?
I hope to live longer so I can do more work. One never knows. I'm continuing to work in the general counsel space because I do a lot of thought leadership in the general counsel space because I think general counsel lawyers have a significant and unique role around leadership and within organizations and in communities in general. And I think, I'd like to think maybe I'm an example of that. There are others too, like Simon Fish from BMO. But in the disability space, I am bound and determined that, and people who know me, I'm just a little kid from Saskatoon who ended up where I ended up. And if nothing else, is because I'm very persistent in what I do. I am bound and determined, for as long as I can, to play a role in creating a completely different model around the hiring, retention, promotion of people with disabilities, how we serve people with disabilities within organizations, and how we serve people, customers with disabilities. And I'm watching this very carefully. I like to think I'm part of a company now which has a completely different approach to this, which is going to make a fundamental difference in how society and the economy operates. And that's what I plan to do as much as I can before I retire.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ken. I don't have any more questions.
They're great questions. Thanks so much. I enjoyed the conversation.
So I have a microphone, and we'd love to hear if there are any questions from our audience today. So please just wave at me, and I'll bring you the microphone if you have something else you'd like to ask Ken. Whoa, way at the back. Two of them. That's all right. I needed the exercise.
I applaud you in your work, but what I'm hearing you say is, to me, it pertains mostly to people with disabilities that are physical. As a mother of 8 with FASD, I am concerned about employment of children with an intellectual disability. And especially when FSD is one of the most prominent disabilities in Canada, I don't hear it addressed a lot. And like I say, as a mother, it annoys me no end. And also, I also have 2 transgender children, so thank you very much for your work on gender recognition.
Thank you. I love the flag here. You know, and we took the position that it was 2S LGBTQ to recognize the origins of 2S, the importance of it in Indigenous communities before settlers arrived. But no, I could talk a lot about neurodiversity. So one of the things that we did, which is really cool, and I'm not going to take credit for this, I was just helping it as a leader, is that we partnered with a company called Auticon. I don't know if you've heard of Auticon, but they hire neurodiverse people, and they are a consulting firm. So they would bring in neurodiverse consultants that would be partnered with our consultants at Deloitte. And their work was phenomenal. And it was focused totally on neurodiversity. You know, in the tech space, there's a lot more neurodiversity than we know of. But it's there. I think that the whole neurodiversity, we're just scratching the surface now of the potential of the opportunities that exist for people like that. Now, there are other forms of intellectual disability that are a little more complicated, and no disability is like another. So for me, it's all around how do you create space within an organization that is about educating, about accommodating, with leaders that are sensitive and can draw out the pest in people. And I was talking to Brandon before, is that one of the things, I just wrote a chapter in the book on leadership. And one of the big things that we need to be talking about everywhere, but I think in corporate Canada where I play, is around service leadership. And that's about how you serve people. It's not about you at all as a leader. You're lucky to have that role. It's about how you as a leader perceive your obligation to serve. And I think the disability space is a really important one. And that's going to be difficult at times, right? Like, disabilities aren't necessarily simple. When you're talking about bipolar, schizophrenia, other parts of the neurodiversity sort of spectrum of those things can be difficult at times. But what I learned was, so often you'll have a leader that actually has personal experience with that. And they understand how important it is because they're a parent too. And one of the great engagement tools we used at Deloitte was understanding that when as a corporation we started talking about the importance of this, we had parents saying, thank God you're doing this, because we didn't know what the future's held for our children with these disabilities, but we're doing something about your leader. And the engagement of those employees, those parents, people with disabilities, huge. Huge. Again, that's part of the business equation, that everybody wins by this. So there's more to be done, but I think there's more interest and exploration of neurodiversity than there ever has been before.
Any other questions?
I have to tell one interesting story I think you'll like.
Sure.
If you have any other questions. So one of the things that I was very lucky to do is I flew down with David Onley when he was Lieutenant Governor to a Walgreens. Does everybody know what Walgreens is in the US? They're a pharmacy, a big pharmacy, right? And there was a guy down there named Randy Lewis. And Randy, we talk about it in the report, by the way. Randy Lewis, great guy, stay in touch with him. He was Vice President of Operations. Now, Randy had a son who was autistic. And Randy sort of thought to himself, how come my son isn't working? So Randy put his mind to it when they built a new operations center in Connecticut to create a facility that was completely inclusive in its design, that would welcome and hire, retain, promote people with disabilities within that facility. And over 50% of the people in that Walgreens facility were people with disabilities. It was a full spectrum, from blind to deaf to neurodiverse, bipolar, schizophrenic, wheelchair, mobility, everything was in that one facility. And I flew down with David and we toured through this facility. It was phenomenal. It was phenomenal. You know, some of the learnings from people that work there around signage, around all sorts of things that actually helped other people, it was just amazing walking through this facility. That facility was the most productive facility in the entire Walgreens network, that facility. And he attributed it to the fact that he had hired more than 50% of people with disabilities. You know, I said to Randy, I talked to him, and I said, you know, how, like it took a leader, right? It took him as a leader to say, we're going to do this. And he risked his career on this, but it proved to be successful. But I asked him about how it worked, and, you know, and one thing he told me, I'll never forget, was, you know, he said, when people applied for a job there, and it was known as a hiring company of people with disabilities, not one person disclosed their disability. They only disclosed it once they got the job. Now, that was 10 years ago. That's about stigma. It's about people not understanding that actually you truly are welcome. I think that today, that's one of the most significant changes in corporate Canada, is that the disclosure, not that you have to, but that actually people should not be afraid. It's the same issue that LGBTQ went through 10, 15 years ago. Is it safe to disclose that I'm gay? And the answer is yes, absolutely. In fact, it might be to your benefit in terms of getting employment. Companies today are looking to hire people with disabilities. And if you know what you're good at and you know how you're going to serve that company well, I will almost guarantee you're going to get a job in corporate Canada because they're looking to hire people with disabilities. So to your question, I think now the ball's kind of over to the court of people with disabilities. You want work, you can get that work. There's an appetite for people to hire people. Not all companies, but the good ones are focusing on this, and I think you'll see it on the website whether there's a real intention to hire and they're legitimate about it. So I'm excited about that. Anyway.
This could take a while. I sure could.
Thank you for the discussion today. I'm a recent graduate of the U of S, and I'm looking for. I look on Indeed every day, and I'm looking at all of the qualifications for different jobs, and I might be able to do 3 or 4 or maybe 5, but then it's overwhelming, like a whole list. So how do you go about that?
Yeah, you and I can have another talk after, but let me just give you an example that might help you a little bit. And that was, there was a lawyer with disabilities, just graduated from law school at U of T. Did very well, marks excellent. Cerebral palsy, because he told me. And he said, I've been looking, I sent out like hundreds of emails for employment. He said, I can't get any jobs. And he was despondent. He was despondent. He didn't know what to do and where to go. And somebody referred him to me, and so I talked to him about it, and we worked it through. And through that, figured out what he really loved to do, which was research. And I connected him up with a couple of law firms that needed a researcher. He's now contracting to them to do the research. They get somebody that is cheaper than if they were to hire a lawyer, and he gets work that he wants to do, and he can do it when he wants it and at home. So it was a perfect match. Now, he never thought of that because nobody ever told him that there were alternatives to simply being a lawyer in a law firm. And I think that, you know, just by me talking to him to say, look, have you thought about this, and what are you really interested in, connecting the dots, I haven't heard from him in a while because I know he's doing well, because I talked to the law firm he's doing work for. He's doing great work for them. Now, that might lead to something else. I don't know. But, I think it's that entry point, like all young people, that entry point into meaningful work in the right place, and then developing from that experience into something more. And that's exciting. And young people should be very excited by that, whether you're typically able or whether you're disabled. So I'm happy to chat with you after a little bit more about that, to give you some of my experience and observations, because there is a great job for you out there. You've just got to find it. It'll be there. By the way, I tend to be an optimist, but I've learned, just because I've been around for so long, that why shouldn't I be? It's remarkable. Sometimes we're our own worst enemies.
Thank you so much for the discussion today. I just want to go back to your comment, too, that you're making on some of the lessons learned from the pandemic and stuff as well. In corporate Canada, we still tend to migrate towards like traditional 5-day-a-week work weeks with like the 9-to-5 jobs. Are you noticing that discussions around that are happening as well to help support more inclusive environments for people with disabilities?
Well, it's a funny thing. I mean, look, Toronto is just like, I don't know if you have driven in Toronto, but it's like, commuting. It's horrible. It's just horrible. And so, a young parent, saying, I like the idea of me dropping my kids off at school, whether it's a man or a woman. Like, I like that. Like, I don't want to go back in to that rat race that I had before. It's not a lifestyle I want to live. Corporations are being challenged on this, and some of them are taking a very strict rule that, no, you've got to come into the office. Some are saying 1 day a week for team meetings. Some are saying 2 days. You can pick which 2 days. Some are saying 3. There's a word which I won't use, which describes what's happening in Toronto, which is those that work Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in Toronto. And what used to be a Friday going out for dinner is now a Thursday going out for dinner. So you can't get a reservation on a Thursday because people are not going to work Mondays and they're not going to work on Fridays. And that wouldn't have happened before. And I challenge an employer that wants to attract and retain great talent to say, no, you got to come in 5 days a week. There would be an exodus of people leaving, great talent leaving that company. That's what they're facing. So the issue becomes then, how do you adapt in a way that it becomes more flexible? I came to the conclusion as a leader that flexibility was everything to retaining great talent, whether it's when you started, when you left, or where you worked. And so I think you're going to find companies understanding that if you want the best talent, you're going to have to be more flexible in how you work. That's a good thing for people with disabilities, but it's also a downside to that I think we have to be careful of. And that is that if you are the only person not in the office, you are missing out on opportunities for leadership, for mentorship, for opportunities. And I think it's too easy to say it's easier to work from home, when really we have to be careful about making sure it's easier to get to work for everybody. And so that people get the opportunities to take on leadership roles. And that's what I worry about. You talk about promotion and retention, that opportunity may be lost for people with disabilities if they're just going to work from home for 5 days a week. That I think we have to be careful of. And by the way, it's not only for people with disabilities, it's for a parent with a child who wants to work from home. I think they become in a bit of a wasteland potentially around their career, which is not a good thing.
More questions? Those are really good ones that came up. Oh.
Yeah, what's available for people with disabilities on self-employment? Are there any grants available for that?
I don't know about that, but I know from the experience I've had that, the few examples I have, in a way it's no different for somebody who's disabled or typically abled in terms of potentially doing consulting work. In fact, I was talking to a guy a couple of weeks ago. He's actually from Saskatchewan, and he left a role. He's now doing consulting work. He is blind, and he was doing great business. You know, he'd set up his company, he was doing his consulting work. I think it can be a little bit more difficult. I think what you need then is a mentor and a coach to help you understand what, but I tell you, I'm a consultant, I have my own company, I need help. How do you set it up? How does it work? What do I need to do? All those things. I don't think I'm any different than somebody else who's disabled who's setting up a consulting firm, in my opinion. But I don't have that lived experience, so it might be a lot more difficult. But what I've learned from my friends who are people with disabilities is that, you know, it's just like accommodations. Ask the person what they need. They figured it out. They know. Ask them, and then bring those accommodations they figured out to the office. That's all. That's all people with disabilities want. Like, I just want the same experience here as I've come to expect at home. You know, people with disabilities know what they need. It's not that complicated for companies to accommodate. Oh no.
Uh-oh, it's
comes
the
the tough
sister.
question. Aren't we out of time?
Just, this is all very interesting. One thing that I remember you saying about that Walgreens place was there was one fellow who maybe was on the autism spectrum, I'm not sure, but he had a certain behavior, I don't remember what it was, that could have been perceived as disruptive, but the whole thing got turned on its head and it was seen as.
Yeah.
So it's around education.
I love that. I love that. I was on a, I don't know if any of you know AIM, A-I-M?
Ability in me?
Anyway, by the way, you didn't ask me this question. DSO, I'm on the board of DSO, which is a newly formed board, not-for-profit, Disability Screen Office, which is the equivalent of BSO and ISO, which is Indigenous and Black. And that's about getting more people with disabilities on screen and behind screen. And so AIM had this program. It still runs. Actually, I don't know why I did this, but I was watching TV one day. I was scrolling through, and there I came up. I was on the TV, and it was around. They had used an episode of me at Deloitte with a woman with what was it now? I forget now. Anyway, it'll come to me. It's so funny. Anyway. The thing about it was, and I forget who I was talking to about this, or somebody said it this morning, the more visible people can be, the better it is. The more used to we get to these things. So this answer to Shirley, what you're talking about was, there was a guy at Walgreens who, whenever a certain color came down, you know, of a box came down the conveyor to fill up, he would do a dance. He'd start singing and doing a dance because that was his color. And I think it was purple. And initially, the manager said, we can't have this, it's disruptive. It's, we can't have somebody disrupting other people in their work. And then they quickly turned it around to say, actually, this was an opportunity. So everybody, when he did his dance, would do a dance too, and they'd all sing. And everybody would celebrate in this color that this guy loved. And it was like a positive engagement tool they used from this guy who was very visible with that particular part of his disability. And I think that what corporations need to do is think about the visible representation of people and understanding that a lot of disability is not visible, and start understanding and celebrating that. As something as a part of the corporate culture. And that's what I took away from that. There's some other stories he told me as well, but I think that corporate culture, of building that corporate culture, creates community and it creates engagement of employees. And that's part of the business case that comes from doing this kind of work. I think it's lunchtime. You've been a great audience, by the way. Thank you so much for your questions. I really appreciate it.
To Ken and Mariah for this very interesting session.
Great.
Yes.
She did her work. Well done.
I do want to just quickly tell you a little anecdote. Part of the reason we're here today is because of Ken Fredeen. What happened was that some years ago, I must have been looking you up, Ken. I don't know why. And I found an article.
Ken.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Where did he go? And there was an article about his involvement in the disability space, and one of the things that was mentioned was that he had worked with a gentleman in his workplace who he considered to be a kind of a mentor or almost a consultant, you could say. And it put the idea in my head, oh, a disability consultant, maybe that's what Grosvenor should have as we embark on this journey to making our space more accessible. And so we ended up applying for a grant, and along the way we met Mariah, who seemed like the perfect person for us. And then we decided to apply for a grant to have this conference. And so if it hadn't been for seeing Ken's article, I don't know if we would be here today. But thank you again for all the wisdom that you bring, all the passion you bring to the disability space. And we just have a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I
Thanks so much.